Visualize this scene. It's December 22nd, 1944. 4 German soldiers are advancing under a white flag, traversing the snow-blanketed Belgian countryside. They carry what they perceive as a mere formality, an offer of surrender, an ultimatum no sensible commander would reject. The message is stark: surrender within 2 hours, or face utter devastation. Yet, what they didn't anticipate was encountering individuals who had fundamentally redefined the concept of insurmountable odds. Unbeknownst to them, they were about to receive the most iconic one-word response in military chronicles, and what they could not possibly have foreseen was that their supposedly invincible 1st SS Panzer Division would soon be in full flight from a contingent of paratroopers who, by all rights, shouldn't have been there in the first place. Today, we delve deeply into the ordeal of Bastogne, a battle that transcended the mere defense of a strategic crossroads. It was a moment when average American soldiers chose to embody defiance, proving that sometimes the most potent rejoinder to an ultimatum is a single, unyielding word: nuts. The man destined to deliver that legendary response was Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division, born in 1898 in Washington, D.C. McAuliffe, an artillery officer by training, had dedicated decades to preparing for a scenario he could never have truly envisioned. By December of 1944, the 56-year-old general found himself unexpectedly at the helm, assuming command when the division's regular commander sustained injuries just prior to the commencement of the German offensive. However, here's where the narrative takes a compelling turn. McAuliffe and his troops were never meant to be in Bastogne at all. The 101st Airborne had been undergoing rest and reconstitution in France, recovering from their arduous campaigns in Normandy and Operation Market Garden. By all accounts, this was a division that had already expended every ounce of its strength. Many of the soldiers were replacements. Numerous others were recovering from injuries. They had been withdrawn to the rear to heal, to recuperate, and to brace themselves for whatever lay ahead. Then came December the 16th, 1944, the day that irrevocably altered the course of events. Adolf Hitler had launched his final, desperate gambit, a colossal offensive through the Ardennes forest that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. In a single morning, everything the Allied forces believed they understood about the faltering Nazi war machine was obliterated. Over 300,000 German soldiers, bolstered by more than 1,000 armored vehicles, breached American lines with a ferocity that stunned even seasoned commanders. The velocity of the German advance was both breathtaking and terrifying. Within mere hours, American units were being overwhelmed, encircled, or compelled into a disorganized retreat. The meticulously planned Allied winter offensive had devolved into a desperate struggle for survival. And directly in the path of this German onslaught lay a small Belgian town that most Americans had never even heard of: Bastogne. Why Bastogne? Because within the dense, undulating terrain of the Ardennes, all 7 major roadways in the region converged at this singular point. To control Bastogne was to control all movement throughout the entire sector. To lose Bastogne meant an unobstructed highway for the German panzers straight to the port of Antwerp, potentially bifurcating the Allied forces and fundamentally altering the entire trajectory of the war. On December 17th, with German forces rapidly advancing toward this pivotal crossroads, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower made a decision that would echo through history. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, his sole available reserves, were to be urgently dispatched to Belgium. The 82nd would proceed north to Verviers. The 101st was destined for Bastogne. The journey was arduous, over 100 miles in open-top trucks, battling a brutal winter climate, racing against time as German spearheads closed in from multiple directions. The men of the 101st did not fully grasp the gravity of their destination. Yet they could discern the increasing rumble of artillery with every passing mile. McAuliffe arrived in Bastogne with the initial elements just after midnight on December 19th. By 9 a.m., the entire division had arrived, a mere 4 hours before the first German units reached the town's outskirts. 4 hours. That's how narrowly they avoided arriving too late. But the 101st was not alone. They were joined by Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, a unit that had been rapidly redeployed north from General Patton's 3rd Army. Together, these combined forces, comprising weary paratroopers and battle-hardened tank crews, were tasked with defending a perimeter around Bastogne against an adversary that outnumbered them by at least 3-1. The defense of Bastogne defied every conventional military precept regarding advantageous odds and defensive postures. By all established wisdom, the Americans should have initiated a withdrawal the moment they comprehended the sheer scale of the German offensive. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and within days they would be completely encircled with no prospect of immediate reinforcement. The 101st Airborne established an all-encompassing perimeter, utilizing every available unit. The 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment held the northwest sector. The 506th blocked the northern approaches from Noville. The 501st defended the eastern approaches. The 327th Glider Infantry Regiment extended from Mans de Saint-Étienne in the southeast to Cham in the west. Engineers, artillerymen, cooks, clerks, every individual capable of wielding a rifle was pressed into infantry duty. What truly distinguished this defense was the caliber of leadership at every echelon. These were not merely soldiers executing orders. They were men who understood that sometimes a stand must be made not because victory is assured, but because retreat would entail sacrificing something far more precious than one's own life. They were fighting for one another, for their nation, and for the conviction that freedom was worth any price. The German strategy was elegantly simple. The 6th Panzer Army, commanded by SS General Sepp Dietrich, was to breach the lines in the north using their most elite formations, including the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. The 5th Panzer Army, under General Hasso von Manteuffel, was to seize Bastogne and Saint-Vite. The 7th Army would secure the southern flank. It was envisioned as a swift, decisive campaign, concluded within days. However, the Americans in Bastogne harbored a fundamentally different vision for how this narrative would unfold. As the German encirclement tightened around Bastogne, the situation grew increasingly dire. Provisions, ammunition, and medical supplies dwindled to critical levels. The adverse weather grounded Allied aircraft, precluding any resupply airdrops. German artillery relentlessly bombarded the town around the clock. Civilians sought refuge in basements as their homes crumbled above them. By December 20th, Bastogne was completely isolated. German forces controlled every access road into the town. Radio intercepts revealed the massing of substantial German armored units for a final assault. It was abundantly clear to all, both German and American, that this situation could not endure much longer. The German recourse was to offer the Americans a dignified exit. On December 22nd, at approximately 11:30 in the morning, a delegation of 4 German soldiers approached under white flags. The party comprised Major Wagner of the 47th Panzer Corps and Lieutenant Helmuth von Hammerstein of the Panzer Lehr Division, accompanied by 2 enlisted men. The surrender ultimatum they bore was a masterful blend of military protocol and psychological manipulation. It acknowledged the American valor while starkly illustrating the futility of their predicament. The message stipulated the honorable surrender of the town within 2 hours, warning that refusal would result in the complete annihilation of the American forces and would hold the Americans accountable for civilian casualties once the artillery bombardment commenced. Upon receiving the ultimatum, McAuliffe's immediate reaction was straightforward and instinctive. He chuckled and declared, "Nuts." He then proceeded to address more pressing matters, apparently dismissing the matter as settled. However, his staff reminded him that a formal written response was expected. This presented McAuliffe with a peculiar quandary. How does one formally convey a defiant rejection to an enemy while maintaining a semblance of military decorum? Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard suggested employing McAuliffe's initial utterance. "You said nuts. That would be tough to top," he remarked. And thus, one of the most celebrated pieces of military communication in American history was conceived. McAuliffe penned a concise reply to the German commander. "Nuts, the American commander." When the German officers received this response, they were perplexed. They failed to grasp the meaning of nuts. Colonel Joseph Bud Harper had to clarify. "Go to hell." The German officers comprehended that message unequivocally. The nuts reply has been imbued with romanticized significance over the decades. However, it is crucial to understand its true import in that specific moment. This was not mere bravado or ostentatious heroism. It was the calculated decision of a professional soldier who had thoroughly assessed his situation, weighed his alternatives, and concluded that surrender was simply unacceptable. McAuliffe later elucidated that his men were inflicting a severe mauling upon the Germans, and he felt the enemy's demand was entirely incongruous with the prevailing circumstances. This was not based on unfounded optimism, but on tangible tactical realities. Despite being surrounded, the Americans were inflicting substantial casualties on every German assault. Their defensive positions were robust, and their morale remained high. Yet a more somber facet of this narrative exists, one that challenges our comfortable interpretations of a good war. The 1st SS Panzer Division, among the units pressing the assault on Bastogne, had already been implicated in some of the war's most heinous atrocities. On December 17th, members of Kampfgruppe Peiper murdered 84 American prisoners in what became known as the Malmedy Massacre. On the very same day, 11 African-American soldiers were subjected to torture and execution near Wereth. These were not the actions of professional soldiers adhering to military traditions. They were war crimes perpetrated by an ideologically driven force that had utterly disregarded the established laws of warfare. The men defending Bastogne were aware of this. They had heard the reports. They understood that surrendering to certain German units might not signify captivity, but rather a grim end. This context imbues McAuliffe's decision with even greater significance. He was not merely refusing to relinquish a military position, he was refusing to hand his men over to an enemy that had demonstrably proven it could not be trusted to uphold the basic tenets of civilized warfare. At times, the ethically correct choice aligns perfectly with the strategically sound one. When we juxtapose this with other monumental sieges in military history, such as Thermopylae, the Alamo, or Stalingrad, a common thread emerges. There are junctures when the strategic importance of a location recedes, overshadowed by the symbolic weight of resolute defiance. Bastogne represented one such moment. The 101st was not simply defending a transportation hub. They were safeguarding the very principle that free individuals would never willingly submit to tyranny. Following McAuliffe's iconic reply, the true crucible began. The Germans, incensed and indignant, unleashed their full might upon Bastogne. The Luftwaffe initiated a fortnight of relentless bombing. Artillery shells rained down without cessation. The elite 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte, Hitler's personal guard unit, was rapidly deployed to the sector to spearhead what was intended to be the decisive assault. However, on December 23rd, the weather began to improve. For the first time in a week, Allied aircraft were able to take to the skies. C-47 transport planes roared over Bastogne, parachuting much-needed supplies. P-47 Thunderbolts descended with fury to engage German armor. The tide was turning. On December 26th, the vanguard of General George Patton's Third Army breached the German lines. A Sherman tank, christened Cobra King, was the first to reach the 101st's perimeter. The siege was broken. But here is what elevates this narrative to extraordinary heights. Upon the arrival of relief, not a single member of the 101st Airborne ever acknowledged requiring rescue. They had held their ground. They had prevailed. And when the Germans ultimately retreated, it was the vaunted 1st SS Panzer Division that found itself in full flight, battered, demoralized, and defeated by men they had expected to surrender without resistance. The Battle of the Bulge persisted for another month, yet its outcome was no longer in question. Hitler's final gamble had failed, and he would never again possess the opportunity to alter the war's trajectory. The cost was immense, exceeding 80,000 American casualties, including nearly 19,000 fatalities. However, the 101st had demonstrated something profound that every American soldier who followed in their footsteps would carry into combat. Sometimes, the most effective response to seemingly insurmountable odds is to stand firm and fight. Ultimately, that single word, nuts, came to symbolize far more than the defiance of one general. It embodied the spirit of every American who ever confronted tyranny and chose to resist rather than capitulate. It personified the unwavering belief that freedom is a cause worth defending, even when defeat appears inevitable. And it proved that occasionally, when one is told there is no alternative, the most potent response is to demonstrate the fallacy of that assertion. The men of the 101st Airborne were granted 12 hours to surrender. Instead, they fought until the 1st SS was in full retreat, thereby etching one of the most inspiring chapters into the extensive saga of American fortitude under fire. They remind us that heroism is not born from the absence of fear, but from the resolve to stand resolute in its presence, to safeguard what is most cherished, and to persevere without ever yielding. Yet the story does not conclude with the liberation of Bastogne. What transpired subsequently reveals even greater insight into the character of these remarkable soldiers. Despite being surrounded, outgunned, and subjected to relentless bombardment for an entire week, the 101st was not content to simply maintain defensive positions once the siege was lifted. They immediately transitioned to offensive operations. The division participated in the grueling month-long campaign to push the German forces back to their initial positions. They recaptured villages such as Foy and Neuville, which they had been compelled to abandon in the initial stages of the engagement. They battled under brutal winter conditions, advancing through snow-laden forests and frozen fields, engaging veteran German units in their final, desperate stands. During these operations, the 101st confronted some of the most elite formations within the German military. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Hitler's personal bodyguard unit, had been redeployed south from their unsuccessful offensive in the northern sector of the Bulge. These were not ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers. They were the pinnacle of the Nazi military elite, seasoned veterans of campaigns spanning Europe and the Soviet Union. Yet, when these supposedly invincible SS troops encountered the paratroopers of the 101st in sustained combat, something extraordinary occurred. The very soldiers who had been informed they faced complete annihilation mere weeks prior systematically dismantled one of Germany's premier fighting formations. The 1st SS Panzer Division, which had instilled fear across Europe for years, found itself repeatedly outmatched in combat, outmaneuvered, and ultimately compelled to retreat by American soldiers who were not expected to possess comparable battlefield experience. This reversal of fortune illuminates a profound truth about the nature of military excellence. The German units possessed superior weaponry, extensive combat experience, and fanatical ideological motivation. However, they lacked something that the Americans possessed in abundance: the moral clarity derived from fighting for a just cause, the bonds of brotherhood forged in shared adversity, and the unshakable conviction that free men fighting for their homes and families are ultimately invincible. The individual accounts from this period are extraordinary. Private First Class Angelo Speranza recounted the decimation of an entire German company that inadvertently advanced into a perfectly executed ambush at 400 yards. When they got to 400 yards, he recalled, the lieutenant said, now, and we opened up with everything we had. It was a slaughter. These were not professional killers reveling in violence. They were citizen soldiers who had evolved into more formidable warriors than even the enemy's finest troops. The cost was considerable. Throughout the entirety of the Bastogne campaign, the 101st sustained 482 killed in action, 2,449 wounded, and 527 missing or captured. Yet they achieved something that resonated far beyond their casualty figures. They conclusively demonstrated that American soldiers, when provided with competent leadership and fighting for principles in which they believed, could vanquish any adversary on earth. The psychological impact on German morale was devastating. If elite SS units could not break a surrounded American division, if Hitler's personal guards were fleeing from paratroopers, then what hope remained for the Reich? The myth of German military invincibility, already showing cracks after defeats in North Africa and Italy, shattered irrevocably in the snows surrounding Bastogne. That is the enduring lesson of Bastogne. That is the legacy of the Nuts reply. And that is why, 80 years later, we continue to recount this narrative of ordinary men who performed extraordinary deeds when their nation needed them most. They demonstrated that courage is not the absence of fear, but the conscious decision to stand firm despite it, to protect what holds the greatest value, and to never, ever give up. They showed us that freedom will always triumph over tyranny when honorable men refuse to yield.